Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lorenzo.
And welcome to this week's Thoughtful Thursday. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Hacking Your Leadership and leave us a review on iTunes. For this week's Thoughtful Thursday, I want to talk about something that I was reading a couple days ago. The Pew Research Org came out with a study that listed the top reasons why people quit their jobs in 2021. And I opened the article thinking, "Ooh, this is going to be good. Let's see what the reasons are, right?" And they started listing the reasons, and it said, I'll read the top five, and then I want to tell you what I think about this. Number one, pay was too low. Number two, no opportunity for advancement. Number three, they felt disrespected at work. Number four, because of childcare issues. And number five, not enough flexibility to choose when to put in hours. Okay, so there are other reasons too, but those were the top five. And none of them stood out to me as being like a reason that didn't exist before. Like if you think about before 2021, before 2020, before the Great Resignation, before the pandemic, these were the reasons people left jobs in 2005, right? It's the difference is that more people are doing it now, so we want to talk about it. We want to have these conversations. But the one that kind of jumped out at me was childcare issues, and being as high as it is, it's like nobody gets a job not knowing what the commitment is, and then all of a sudden it's like, "Ooh, I didn't realize that no one was going to be at home with my kids. I can't be at this job." It's because the pandemic caused a lot of the kids to be at home. They weren't allowed to be at school or at daycare anymore. They had to be at home, and then that forced a parent to have to be at home with them. And so that changing environment caused childcare issues to become a thing. And it's interesting because this is one of those things where it's like, clearly the numbers add up to more than 100%, which means people can choose more than one answer. And so clearly it was, something else was wrong. And then now there's a childcare issue too. And those items together are kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. And now I got to move on. But it reminded me of the interview that I had with Johnny C. Taylor, the head of SHRM, last June or July. And an example that he gave when he was leading a team of people that I thought was profound and really uncomfortable too. The example he gave was that he had an employee come to him once and say that based on what time they had to drop their kids off at school, they couldn't be at work until 9:15 or 9:30 or whatever, even though start time was at 9:00. And he said, "Yeah, of course, I totally understand. Let's figure out how to make it so you can get your kids to school when they need to be there, and then you come to work. And I understand that's why you're coming in a few minutes late." And then another employee approached him after a few months of this and said, "Hey, I've noticed that this person's coming to work late every single day. Is it a flexible start time now that I wasn't aware of?" Like not trying to poke the bear or cause problems, but genuinely asking, like, "I didn't realize this was a thing." And he said, "No, it's not. This is a situation that I worked out with this employee, and that's why they're coming to work late." And the other employee's response was, "Well, then I want to be able to come to work late too. Like, how come they get to come to work at 9:25 and I don't get to come to work at 9:25? And he said, "Well, that's between me and that employee. That's something that we worked out. If there's a reason that you think you need to be here at 9:25 instead of 9:00, we can talk about that. I can have that conversation with any employee I want to, but this isn't just because one person got it, now you get it too." And I remember feeling very uncomfortable when Johnny was explaining this to me in the interview, because there are very few leaders I know today who would feel comfortable saying that to an employee, being comfortable coming up with an accommodation on their own, not one that was dictated to them by the legal or HR team of the organization, but one where they actually made the decision to accommodate an employee on something, and then be able to say to other employees, "We're not doing the same accommodation because your situation is different." What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, no, I love it because, for those that know me well, I will always say that real great leadership boils down to being courageous and decisive. So courage and decisiveness are like my two big things there that I think really scope, what great leaders do. And I love that idea because I think it shows the understanding that there will always be unique needs that people need to have. And I'm all for it. Like, yeah, if you have a unique need, it may require a unique solution. Mm-hmm. But you have to have a unique need. Right. And the unique need can't be, well, because they have it, then I should too. And there are things in the business world and in leadership that is the case. You want things to be fair. You want there to be, equity in certain situations. But also you want to be able to have a space where if you need something, different than they need something, that you and I can have that conversation. Because what you need might be for a week, it might be for a month, it might be for the short term. Like there might be things involved that we can talk through, understand, figure out, and work through that make sense for what you're requesting, but that can have so many different layers and nuance to somebody else asking for something similar,
Sure.
With a different need. So like I love that courageous response, and I love that like that's what we do. So if there's something you want to talk about, I'd love to talk to you about it. But just because somebody else has this or is getting this doesn't equal you now also get the same thing, because that's not what we're doing here. So I like, hats off, but I could see that's a really not so much maybe like promoted type of response or dialogue that you'd have this day and age. But hats off to him for having it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I look at like a more obvious example where it would not lead to the same kind of, having to make decisions like this. And let's look at a job where maybe the requirement for the job is that you're standing. You're standing and walking around. An employee coming to you and saying, oh, how come this person gets to sit all day when I have to stand all day? And then your response is, well, they're in a wheelchair. Like, so what are you implying? Like, are you implying that they're choosing to be in a wheelchair? Because obviously that's not what you're implying. So it's a ridiculous example, obviously, and it's one that most people wouldn't bring up, but yet they do feel comfortable bringing up something else that isn't like a medical need, because in their mind, what they've done essentially is they've made a personal judgment that this isn't something that is an actual requirement, that it's something that's a nice to have. It's like, well, if they really wanted to get to work at 9, they could. They'd find a way around it to get their kid to school early enough to where they get to work at 9. The fact that they're not is something that they're choosing not to do, or that they're just not working hard enough or trying hard enough to do. Whereas you would never imply that about a person who has to be in a wheelchair. And so it's an interesting situation, because I don't think there's any space between the two. I think a need is a need, and assuming that when your employees come to you with what a need is, what they're saying is a need, it's not our job as leaders to make moral judgments or imply our own kind of level of what we think is a need, or project our own life onto that. If they're saying it's a need, as a leader, it's our job to assume that's a need. Now, are there limitations about what we can do and what we can't do? Sure. So like you a lot of the people who report to you are hourly. If someone said, I have a need where I can't be at work until 11 o'clock every day, of course you're going to accommodate them not be working at 11 o'clock till 11 o'clock. But you wouldn't say, we're also going to clock you in at 9, even though you're not going to be at work at 11 o'clock. They're hourly employees, and they get to start work at 11, and they clock in at 11. That's just how it works. The accommodation is the availability of when they can be there versus not. On salaried jobs, maybe it's a little bit more vague. But if the work is getting done, the work is getting done. Maybe the person who comes to work 20 minutes late is staying 20 minutes later, and you're not seeing them stay 20 minutes late because you left at 5 when everybody else left, and you don't see that person leaving until a little bit later. So again, it's nuanced, but what I would love to ask you, Lorenzo, is do you have an example that you can give where you've made an accommodation for a person reporting up to you, where it was something where you then had to explain to somebody else that this wasn't necessarily the case for them. It was a one-off, and we can talk about this, just like Johnny C. Taylor told me. But first, I want to give it up to word for one of our sponsors. All right, Lorenzo, tell me about a time when you had to give or make an accommodation to an employee, and it was one where you really couldn't give it to everybody, and not everybody needed it, but it may have caused some strife amongst other employees.
Yeah, absolutely. I can think of one where there was a kind of a religious accommodation, but it wasn't necessarily for like the service at hand, but they had a very, very big part in leadership within their church, and so they needed these Saturday afternoons to be off, to be able to prepare for and help lead what was going to happen in one of the services that was going to happen on a Sunday. So where somebody would normally say, like, I have a religious accommodation, or this is what I have, like, of course the right thing to do is to like seek to understand, what do you need? What does that look like? What can we help you with? How can we work to make sure that you have what you need and the business has what it needs? But this was one of those situations where somebody very clearly was like, this is a religious accommodation. It's not not necessarily like the service or the time, but like I need these Saturdays up to this time to get that done. And I said, yes, of course. Like you're asking for like this month specifically, these 4 leading up to it. That makes sense to me. Let's go ahead and make that happen. And then somebody else had said, hey, I heard so-and-so had this time off for religious accommodation. And I've
decided to join their religion.
Well, no, not necessarily. Yeah, not necessarily. Right. But they had their own, but then they felt like, well, if I also want to be involved, can I have that time? And then my question was like, well, are you involved? Like, what are you asking for here? Like the idea of, if you did it, would you have it? And so we had a really good conversation. And I said, look, if you're coming to me and saying, I have this is important to me, this is what I'm looking for, and just like them, it's kind of temporary, it's preparation, we know what's going on, we can work together. Of course, I would have that conversation with you, but I'm not going to paint this as an answer to your question in a theory of if you were to, what would happen. We'll cross the bridge when we get to it. But yeah, absolutely, it happens, and it happens for all different types of reasons, quite frequently. So it requires a level of flexibility and understanding. But that level of dialogue that you shared earlier, I think, is so important. Of like, if you have something you'd like to talk about, I'd love to talk to you about it. And what exactly are you asking for? What do you need to make this happen? What does that look like? And how can we come to a place where all parties are satisfied? And that's kind of the idea.
Yeah, I think everybody wants the accommodation when it's they who need it, and everybody else explains away an accommodation for somebody else when it's them who needs the accommodation, when it's the somebody else. So it's easy to say, oh, that's ridiculous. Like, they don't really need to prepare for that role at their church. They're just wanting the Saturdays off. Really? I mean, do you hang out with them on Saturdays? Do you know? Or is it just easier for you to dismiss their need or their request because you want to be able to say Lorenzo's playing favorites, or you want to be disgruntled that you couldn't get the same thing too, or that you didn't get the same thing too. It's much harder for a lot of people to live in this space of assuming positive intent and empathy and being able to say, well, clearly they need that. I understand it. I don't need that, so it makes sense why I wouldn't be able to just have Saturdays off in a retail environment. If you want a population of employees that is able to have the diversity needed to make you able to speak to your customers and your clients and your community, sometimes it means bringing people in that can't necessarily work the traditional time or hours that is needed. What you gain from that is the ability to speak to more members of the community, the ability to say to people, hey, you know what, we welcome everybody. No matter what it is, we'll find a place for you if you're a good person and you want to work hard. And so I think, again, it's tough because as leaders, we can't necessarily publish, this is why I gave Lorenzo the time off. This is because it's nobody's business. So you have to be able to explain it in a way as a leader that has the kind of the command skills that says, you know what, there's a reason why this happened. It's none of your business. We can have this conversation too if you want to. And the only way as a leader that you can do that is if the employees see your actions on a day-to-day basis as lining up with that statement about who you are. That I'm the kind of person who doesn't play favorites. I look at each person individually, and if you want to talk about your situation, we can talk about it. And you can see how I act as a leader every single day in the public ways that my leadership faces you and your teammates. If you can't say that, it's a lot harder to get people to have faith that what you're doing is the right thing. They're going to want whatever that lowest common denominator is and to be accommodated for it. So I really think that the ability of leaders to do this really stems from what they do every day and kind of gaining the authority to have these exceptions and have them go over well and go over with the assumption of positive intent as opposed to, getting employees that roll their eyes.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to the end of this episode. This is Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Lorenzo.
And I'm Chris.
And have a great day.